All right. Thank you all for joining us. We'll let the rest of the people who registered trickle in as they may. My name is Jay Castle. I'm the co-chair of the AIA Regional and Urban Design Forum, along with been doing this for the last few years, along with my co-chair Brian Stryzik. I'm really excited about tonight's event. I haven't been to the space yet at Brooklyn Basin, but I was on a Zoom family happy hour for my son's school the other night, and one of our icebreakers is that we always list a park or a public space we'd like to go to and share it with somebody. And one of the other families on the call mentioned Township Commons as one of their favorite new places, so it kind of excited me for tonight. And I actually mentioned it. I haven't seen her on the call yet, but she might be joining us as well. Yeah, and then I also would like to announce that Brian and I have added a third co-chair. Tyler Kobrick's going to be joining us as a co-chair this year. He's been an active participant for the last several years, joining us most months, and we're really excited to have him join us in a more formal capacity. He's actually next Wednesday, he's going to be doing an event at the AIA called A Day in the Life. And it's kind of like get to know an architect. I think it's typically geared for younger architects. And so if you want to find out more about Tyler, you can find it there. I will just mention he has his own firm here in Oakland. It's an architect-led design build firm called Design Draw Build. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tyler to give us some announcements.
Hi, everybody. I am here today just to discuss, and Jay, thank you for the introduction. I appreciate that. I'm here just to briefly mention a couple upcoming events for rudders around the Zoom world. Actually, Jay and I attended an event today called Social Infrastructure is a Right, Places for Gatherings, which is part of Open House New York. It was at 2 p.m. East Coast 5 p.m. It was kind of interesting. It was it was an interesting group of people. They actually had 900 people on the Zoom, and it was a bit more political than I think I thought it was going to be. I was hoping it had a little bit more urban design orientation or a little bit more conversation about kind of the civic condition of libraries. And it was a bit more about the politics of libraries in our current kind of series of social dilemmas we faced for the last year, which is important. In particular, one of the guests, the heavyweight guest lecturer was the librarian for Congress. And she talked a lot about the importance of equity in our library system, but certainly I think a lot more about the service that libraries bring for access to technology and internet availability for folks. And though I personally find that interesting, I was a little disappointed that I at least see that affecting the library system for the next 5 years or 10 years. But I personally, at least as an architect, am more interested in what happens to the physical aspect of the library over the next 20 or 30 years. I thought it was gonna be a little bit more about that. But anyway, it was a good lecture nonetheless. And Open House New York has a lot of lectures and events that can kind of expose you to some of the thinking on the social stratum, and they bring in lots of interesting professors, and the co-presenter for Open House New York, who was with the Librarian for Congress, is a sociologist at NYU, and I thought he seemed like he'd be pretty fascinating to look more into. So just want to recommend Open House New York and their lecture and Zoom series. 2 is that the joint lecture, the joint AIA and UC Berkeley lecture is coming up. That's Wednesday, the 31st of March, 6 to 7 p.m. It's a Vimeo, live stream Vimeo, and that'll be Jeannie Gang and Studio Gang and talking about some of their current work. They have a new one going up in Denver that I recently saw, and that should be a great lecture if you're not aware of her work. She's kind of the preeminent female architect of the world, I think, right now. And then one more quick event to mention. RUD we're trying to get a little bit more organized here this year, and we're a few months scheduled out already with our events. And just a quick plug for the April 1st event, which will be a brainstorming session that Brian and Jay have been heading up, and kind of maybe even leaning on the chapter a bit to kind of open up a conversation around future locations for the chapter in a physical event meeting space, and how that corresponds with the city and the largeness of our chapter, in particular the way in which it kind of goes all the way up into Napa and comes down into southern Alameda County and so forth. So that should be a fun one, and it's gonna be a little bit more participatory, a little less single. Not that all of our lectures and Zooms aren't pretty participatory, but really just mostly a brainstorming session, so a more open session than typical. So with that, I'll pass it over to, I think, Brian to do a little bit more introduction, and look forward to our event tonight.
Tyler. So first of all, this is being recorded, so just so everyone knows. But overall, tonight, the AIA East Bay is honored to have Sarah Keel, the co-founder of Oakland-based Eanweiler Keel Landscape Architecture. During the presentation, we'd like to encourage you to answer questions in the chat window, and at the end, we will hopefully open up to dialogue, answering those questions, and then also just answering questions that you may have verbally. Tonight, Sarah will be speaking about the Oakland Waterfront projects, but the portfolio is varied. It has been great working with Sarah's office on the Eanweiler Keel Architecture and Planning Collaboration at 1150 Clay Street, which is a 16-floor roof terrace for the building residents and a new urban park. EK brings creative, refreshing ideas and technical expertise to their landscape projects that are successful at all scales. Lastly, Sarah's just a great person, someone who you want to call as a friend. She's a talented professional who's passionate about cities, design, art, which is a perfect fit for the AIA East Bay's Regional and Urban Design Forum. Please virtually welcome Sarah Keel.
That was super kind of you, Brian. Thank you. I wish we could do this in person, and unfortunately we can't. So I've structured this so that I'll talk about 3 projects and kind of tell you stories. Brian is going to monitor the chat, and if there's a really juicy, timely question, I'm going to stop and answer it so we can kind of pretend like we're having a conversation, but we'll also have hopefully a larger discussion at the end. And I like to be really clear when I start a lecture that I happen to be a pretty good talker, and I do a lot of the talking for the office, but we're a team. Obviously, Liz Einwiller, a huge part of that team, but also all of our staff. And so this is our work, not my work, and we're really proud of it. So without further ado, we have had great good fortune in being a small office that's not even 10 years old to get to work on some really significant public spaces in Oakland, and in particular to work on 3 public spaces at the waterfront. There are 28 miles of waterfront in Oakland, which is a kind of staggering number considering how little of it you actually interact with. And today I'll be telling you a bit of story about Bridge Yard, which is part of what was called Gateway Park, but is now the John J. Sutter Regional Shoreline, a little bit of work at Jack London, and then most of the talk about Township Commons, but they sort of all add up together. So without further ado, when we started the office, I had been working at Peter Walker Partners and working on some planning for this site at the base of the Bay Bridge. And when a new contract came up for that, I was really fortunate to get my name associated with it, and we were on one team, and we actually got to continue, even though I think our office was like 6 months old at the time. And this is a really extraordinary site in Oakland, but also in terms of its relationship to the bridge and to San Francisco. And it was quite a journey where we probably learned a lot of what we needed to know to do Township Commons, about all of the agencies, all of the regulation, and how to kind of bring something to fruition. And ultimately, we're very pleased that we achieved a consensus among 8 kind of heavy hitting public agencies to have a park in this location, to reach big and make it bigger, to take the Bridgyard building, the Urbies building back into the public realm, and to link it with trails back into neighborhoods where people are. So that was kind of a heavy lift at the beginning, but something that at a planning level has been very successful. It got us thinking a lot about the relationship between trails and open space, and how trails and open space need to work together, and that the best places actually do this very fluidly, where you could move from one space to another, use as many as you want, and move at different speeds through the landscape, whether walking or biking, or as we are now seeing, a lot of roller skating. One of the things we thought about a lot on this, which I feel like has carried through in our work and we think about generally, is what is the three-dimensional experience? One of my pet peeves is that I think a lot of planning is flat and two-dimensional, and the three-dimensional experience of this place was pretty extraordinary, and little changes in height changed what part of the landscape you connected with, or you felt like you could see, or how big the space you were in. And because it's such a narrow space, these little shifts became the way to construct a kind of procession of being in the space. It also shared some things with the Township Commons project, in that the old Urbies building is a significant building that's actually on the historic register, where the key system used to stop and have trains repaired before they went over the Bay Bridge. So it had a lot of things about it that were important to think about, and to think about not just the past, but the future, and how all of those things might come together in something we would do today. We were very fortunate to get to do a kind of proof of concept project for the opening of the Bay Bridge. And so at the end of the Urbies building, we did what was to be a temporary plaza at the time we did it, kind of an insertion that was just going to be there briefly, but I'm starting to realize it might be there a very, very long time, that made space in front of the historic facade of the building, and also gave people a viewing terrace. The insight we had when we were working on this is that inside the mezzanine of the building, where people used to repair fabrics for Caltrans, you could look out and see the water. But when you were on the ground, it was quite opaque, and you actually couldn't see anything. And I used to come out here and wave my arms and say, this could be a great park. We're near the water. It's going to be wonderful. But not being able to see that made it very, very hard for people to imagine what it could be. When we actually made our intervention, I used to joke and say, oh my God, it's our first landscape project and there's not any plants, and people are going to wonder what we're up to here. But I feel like it's a great example of a landscape project which talked to this larger landscape of the bay and the waterfront and the water's edge. So there was a stair, basically a bleacher that was made at one side that lifted you up and gave you views out to the cranes and out to the water, but also created a space with the flatness below that could be used for performance and other things. And when we were done, there was a party for the opening of the Bay Bridge at the completion of construction. And all of the many people from the California Transportation Commission and MTC and others who had been nice to us about our ideas, but not necessarily on board, climbed up on the terrace and all suddenly went, oh, I see what you're talking about, because they could see the bridge. This happens, the clouds are blowing it out here, but it's on axis with the tower. And you could see water on both sides of the toll plaza. And suddenly this felt like landscape to people as opposed to an industrial area. And it was incredibly successful in terms of convincing people that this park really could happen here and could be a space that people would want to go to. The other thing that we did on this project, which is part of our thinking, was to really look for things about the site that were particular, that could only happen here. So the cable for the new bridge was made of cable that was delivered on cable spools and then bound together in a cable compactor. And quite an extraordinary engineering feat, but also when you went to the site, there were all these super cool graphics that we were really drawn to when we were out there. And so we salvaged those and made them into furniture with a local fabricator at Blank and Cables, and figured out how to make double-sided benches and other seating. So there was something that talked to that and made this place feel particular on day one, and that there was something here that couldn't really be anywhere else. The other thing you see in this photo is those are highway stripes, the same size as highway stripes, but they were deployed in such a way that they made kind of a web that took you to the front door of the building, but asphalt and highway striping, because that was what could be done on this project. In conclusion on this one, we felt like we were given a little chance to try some things and start making a case for a park in this location. And we also learned a lot about, what were some things that were going to work, and doing things with salvage, doing things that spoke to architecture, doing things that connected to larger landscapes, that I feel like really set us up for the work we then did at Township Commons. The other pieces of this that I think are interesting from an urban design perspective is there is a larger vision about the Bay Bridge and the transportation corridor of connecting from Oakland all the way to San Francisco, and obviously trying to get a bike path on the west span. So this idea of a highway scale, bridge scale space that's a combination of trails and parks that takes you all the way there is something that is still being worked on, and that this is contributing to, and which we're advocating for as part of our work for the connection to Oakland directly. Right now, there's a bike path that only goes to the north, kind of to where IKEA is and up. And we're looking for a more direct connection to Oakland and the south, and advocating for sort of the equity of that. It feels like only one of the off-ramps from the bike highway was built, and we want it to go both directions and connect to these open spaces to reinforce what we've observed about open spaces and trails needing to work together and needing to link people from neighborhoods to open spaces, particularly at the water's edge. The second project I'm going to talk about is sort of at the other end of Grand. So we got to work on Jack London, and our work at Jack London was very limited. We were brought in to address a bench problem. So these are the existing conditions that we were brought in to evaluate. And it was kind of a stunning thing where, it wasn't even just that they all were almost located the same way, but they were all located in such a way that if you sat down, you looked through the railing. So we did an analysis of this and said, gosh, I think it could be better. And we looked at seating as something that actually has a lot of different social interaction possibilities, different ways to be alone together, or together with people you don't know, or to use things in different ways. And we said, we think we could do a proposal. And we did really funny diagrams about, like, we'll keep the same number of butt spaces that are currently on the benches, and we're going to reconfigure them. And we sort of justified this to the port and BCDC and to the client, and people were on board with making a transformation. This whole idea was partly because Jack London has been sort of struggling to kind of get up and make it. And there's been a number of moments of intervention and things done to try to make it succeed. And I think even the name was confusing, that it was called Jack London Square. And so as part of this, they dropped it and started calling it Jack London. I kept pitching, like, this is actually a good public park. People can come here and do the things they would do at a park, and we should be trying to think about it as much that way as an entertainment retail destination. And so we were looking at what was that little in-between scale that could extend what you might do there. And this was mostly with furniture. This is my totally unfair before and after picture, because the before picture is on a very cloudy, rainy day, and the after picture is on a sunny blue skies day. But our intervention was a combination of paint and new furniture. and then some new planting and a little bit of erasure of things that we thought weren't contributing. So you can see on the left, the railing was white, which kind of makes it harder to see the water, and we painted it dark. We refinished the tops of the handrails, we changed out the furniture, and we kind of made the furniture different kinds of things. So you could have lunch at a table, you could lounge, you could do other things. And a lot of this was done with just attention to clarity around things that you want to look at and things that you don't want to look at, things that you want to fade away and things that you want to use to order. And so you can see kind of our palette that we developed here. The things on the top are new furniture. The things on the bottom were all things that we painted, and we spent a lot of time. That's an example of one of our mock-ups, trying to figure out over the course of the day with the change of sun, which gray would actually go away and be most invisible, so you didn't think about it, and how we could get there. And we took all of the old concrete pots that were very, very white against the background and painted all of those with a stripe and tried to make it so you would see the plants. So my point in sharing this project is our firm is actually unusual, I think, in some ways, in that we do high-end residential and we do small-scale projects, but we build a lot of our work. And so our thinking about urban design or large-scale things is informed a lot by the things we think about at a smaller scale, like color and palette and getting something lined up. So in the end, we ended up with a project that in some ways is very, very simple, but it was a lot about repetition, painting out light posts so you didn't think about them, locating things so that there were places to gather, and really simplifying what was here, and trying to make sort of moments within the landscape that spoke to landscape, that somehow had a gesture to them, to a borrowed landscape or other things. Should I keep going, Brian, or do you want to ask me questions? I'm happy, totally happy either way.
I think we can keep on going.
Okay, great. So the real meat of tonight's discussion is about Township Commons, which we feel incredibly grateful to have gotten to work on, partly because we live in Oakland and feel like this is a contribution to the city that we are really proud of, partly because it's kind of always your dream to get to do a project like this big and this public, and you never know if you're going to get to, and partly because it just had a whole lot of sort of happy accidents along the way in terms of opportunities that we were able to find and make real, but there were some really lucky things here too. The project is located at the mouth of the Lake Merritt channel that connects to the Oakland estuary, and there's about 3,100 units of housing that are going into a 4-phase development. It is a place in the city which has been brownfield sites. It's been used a lot by artists. It's been kind of a no man's land in some ways for a long time. And this development is huge in terms of the transformation of the city at this location. Historically, it also is a place that was on the San Antonio Creek and was mostly water. So when you look at this old map, we've been asked a lot, why is it called Brooklyn? Is this trying to pretend like you're in New York? But there really was a part next, the map of Brooklyn. This is Brooklyn, and it was named for a boat that actually crashed here coming from Brooklyn, New York. But our site really was in the middle of water and marsh, if you look at the long history and the ecology of the area. We were tickled to find this Edward Muybridge photo about the site with the railroad bridges coming across. It's not exactly at the site, but in the Brooklyn neighborhood. And sort of looking at that feeling of this long gesture of getting to look at the water, which we feel like kind of still exists in the park today. But it's a place in the city where getting to just sit and look at the water is a real amenity. And we really think one of the first steps towards sort of building ecology or stewardship in terms of citizenry is actually getting to be near places that have ecology, and that you want to be close to things to begin to value them. So This history of the site evolved, and the 9th Avenue terminal was located here. And before container shipping really moved the Port of Oakland to where it is today, this part of all of the Oakland estuary was really the place to be for shipping and receiving. And so boats came in, trains came in, trucks came in. This is essentially a break bulk terminal where, cotton and lumber and other things were unloaded from ships, dispersed from here, or reloaded on ships. So a whole lot of activity happening at those loading docks. The Port of Oakland in that time was, a leader in its industry, and the transit shed, which is the 9th Avenue terminal, was full of stuff. There was incredible amounts of weight on it. And there was a huge amount of activity and labor that happened in this place. When we started on the project, the developer, which was Signature Development Group, and then they were partnered with ZOHP, had been at it a long time. So we started this in 2015, but there was actually a master plan that Roma Design Group had done, and it was approved in 2006, but it went through almost 10 years of lawsuits after that related to the 9th Avenue terminal. So when we got involved with the project, there had been a very long history that set street width, set building heights. A lot of decisions had been made before we got involved. And one of the reasons we had the opportunity to get involved with this was because the design review committee in Oakland kept saying the proposal doesn't look like Oakland. There's not enough here that's like Oakland. And there had been people protesting that there wasn't enough of the 9th Avenue terminal being preserved, that the story of the history wasn't being told. So one of the first drawings that our office did was this, which I still really believe in from the perspective of making public spaces, which is they should be connected, they might look good together, but they should have strong characters, and that you don't want all of these spaces to be the same. So we really made a case for Shoreline Park having the strongest industrial character. And then as you move upward or leftward on this drawing, that it gets more and more about the natural world and the ecology of this place. So there's a real contrast over the collection of parks at Brooklyn Basin. And when we started, this is kind of what the site looked like. It was already starting to have roads and had been cleared, but the 9th Avenue terminal building was intact. And we were told to take a look at it and to come back and start making some proposals about what this should be. And it's quite, I really like old things and old buildings. And it had that kind of magical ruin quality that a lot of places I like do. If you're kind of a romantic about old buildings, it has that. The trusses were made of this tiny little like half-inch angle, knitted together. It had a lightness that was very beautiful. And we were particularly taken with the photo on the bottom right, where because of the way a railroad track is laid out, because it's the speed at which a train can turn, the whole end of the building actually turned. And there was something really beautiful about that moment in the trusses. We were also really taken by the loading docks and the rhythm and the facade, which we knew at that point the facade had to remain, and with some of the other artifacts that we found on the site. And we were allowed to sort of say, keep this, keep this, keep this. We like that. We don't like that. And somewhere there's other things in a container, including a phone booth from 1974 that we hope to get used on site someday. The other thing we thought a lot about, or I was really taken with on the site, was when you walked on the railroad curves, you've kept feeling like you were approaching the water. You kept feeling like, I'm getting close to the water, but I'm turning away from it. And there was something pretty great about that as an experience of being at the water, to be curving along it that way. That also was a memory of the trains at the site. And we really wanted to keep that in our design. We were really fortunate, I would say, that we had worked at Peter Walker Partners and done a whole lot of very technical work. And this is where I have to sort of especially hat tip to Liz Einwiller, who had been working on the CDs for the Trans Bay Park. Actually, before this, was thinking a lot about being on structure. And then when we came into this is a section showing that the whole 9th Avenue terminal is on piers and is on a wharf. And so our thinking about what to do at this place needed to be informed by a kind of heavy lift of technical decisions in terms of, well, what are you going to keep and how are you going to do that? And we worked with SGH, and there was also a report by Moffitt and Nichols and other people to determine what the health of the wharf really was. And there were some places where it was in real trouble. There were other places that were fine. There was an old rock wall under the wharf that when you ran it through modern seismic code would the rocks would jump around and break things. And so the whole structure that the park is on had to be retrofit to contemporary seismic codes, which was no small feat because the structure had already been compromised in some areas. And that's a photo of us kayaking to see what it was like to come up to the whole office with kayaking to see what it's like to come up to the site from the water, because that seemed important. But you get a sense of something you don't really experience from the land in terms of the view underneath the structure. Oops, let's see. My screen may have frozen. There it is. There we go. Go back one. One thing you can't see now, but I think is important to look at, that is number 9 rebar. And that is an incredible grid of rebar. And so what it took to retrofit this wharf in order for there to be a park here, there's an 8-inch section of concrete underneath the hill, underneath the deck, all over the surface of this wharf that had to be saved. We also had to seismically retrofit all of the trusses. And so there's a whole lot of things that happen just to kind of get to zero on this project. And I think this is some of the luck on the project, is that there was a willingness to do some of this and a commitment to doing some of this, but a lot of money and resource went into things that you don't actually see in the final design. So walking through the design then of what we did, the phase 1 park, some of you are paying close attention may notice that this little part over here, which says phase 2, a little piece of that was in phase 1, but in the final version of this, it got pulled back to really just the extents of the building. And so about 4.5 acres of this, which is this part over here, is the old 9th Avenue terminal. And then there's a lot of area near the Embarcadero that has bioswales and kind of an approach landscape and trails into the site. We really thought about how to do this as kind of an archaeology, wanting to keep kind of a spirit of this building and of this place, but also being very wary of some parks we've seen where people have saved old things, but not necessarily worked into them enough to give you an invitation to go there or to use them now. So there was a desire to keep old things, but to really take to heart this idea of adaptive reuse and to really work into them in ways with interventions that changed how you might imagine using them. So trying to create contemporary conditions that would evoke places to play, places to gather, places for sports. And the one big arching thing for those of you who have worked on the waterfront, this is in with the state lands jurisdiction. And so the rules of the state lands jurisdiction would say that I can't have a basketball court or a playground or anything that would not be considered a regionally drawing amenity. So part of working in and trying to get the spirit of this place was trying to get something that felt like something without some of the things you would do normally to activate a space. So we saved 3 pieces of building. We ended up extending the piece that has the facade on it, which is this one on the right, and making a large covered porch at one end. The middle piece we were calling the garden truss, and it has quite a bit of planting and a kind of smaller scale to it, and vines that will eventually kind of grow all over it. And then the hill truss, which is the one at the end of the building where that wonderful curve is, that has a large grassy hill that's kind of set inside, partly to give a kind of space for performance, but partly to tell you that this is really a park. We didn't want the public to feel confused or gypped or, am I supposed to go there? And so we wanted to do something that played with that idea of a park. The other thing that we got really interested in was the loading docks, and was there a way to keep them? So we ended up making the ramps from 9th Avenue into the park at the location of each one of the loading docks, and they rise you 2 feet up so that the elevation of the deck in the middle is a view over the water. But we kept that geometry, and we actually worked with a graphic design, an environmental designer called Volume, and they really made amazing graphics about those loading dock numbers. But I liked the idea that the labor history of this wasn't forgotten or kind of thrown out as we moved on into new times. And then the third thing was what I talked about a little bit earlier in terms of the movement of cargo or spaces, and we've really thought about the movement of people and how we could kind of build on that. So we took what was the 9th Avenue terminal intact, and we created a recreational landscape that has a lot of this kind of, fossily bones of this place, the spirit of it, but which is now a completely different place. So a few pictures, and then I'll take questions. This is the approach as restored. This was work done on this facade by Michael Willis and Associates Office, and the historic paint colors and so forth were put back. And this is the approach up to the center of the building. This is the other end of the park where the hill truss sort of reaches out over the water with this kind of whale back kind of a hill. The deck, the loading dock numbers that you see pulling through, I'm sitting on my mouse, you see pulling through the ramps between the planters, the stripe that comes all the way across the deck, and then the numbers down on the water side. Inside of that hill truss, you go up about 8 feet to the height of the hill, and it's a place where you see the water differently and you get closer to the truss itself. And it's strange in a good way, and the shadows are really great out there, and people are finding weird ways to use it, as people do. From the center of the deck, looking back at the hill truss, you get a sense of the scale and the openness. And the deck board pattern is arranged in such a way that the light reflects really differently depending upon how the board is laid. And so you get a breaking down of that surface, kind of like corduroy, being brushed different ways, that is really successful in terms of making something of empty space. The planting on the right side is something we really fought for. It's closer to ground, so we were able to do that. We weren't able to have soil really of any significance elsewhere in the park, and we really felt like the planting, again, told you were supposed to be here and gave you some scale. And we used the bright yellow furniture partly to remind people of Jack London, so they would know this was public and they were supposed to come, and partly because of its reference to the industrial things. This is one of the loading docks with the numbers mounted here, a salvaged boat tie-off that we're using as a bollard, and the approach up to the elevated deck. It's really great that the deck is up 2 feet, but the guardrail is down, so it doesn't feel very tall. You feel much closer to the water, and looking down on the water, you feel like it's much more present. inside of those planters, we've seen a lot of birds and pollinators and other creatures making their way here. There's a young pheasant who like thinks this is his home, and looking back out at the watery landscape. And then in the garden truss, you can get a sense of how we retrofit the trusses. If you look closely, you can see where we've added some steel. We've also added a couple of X frames. We worked really, really hard to make sure architects in particular would find this respectable. We wanted it to look like we had succeeded in retrofitting it without ruining it. And we feel pretty pleased with how it turned out. We also fought really hard to keep the marks on the building. There's some old marks and graffiti, and we clear coated them, but they're there. And you can see how one of the loading dock numbers in the foreground then is sort of relating to the old opening there. This is the walk along the water on the other side of the deck, and the loading dock numbers are designed in such a way that if you took a picture from up in an airplane, they would actually be the same digital pattern of water. So it's sort of evoking the shoreline on one side, but you can see this very broad area along this side and a very simple guardrail in connection to the water. And I think the thing that maybe we're most proud of is when we went to the design review committee and things, they said, but how will the public know they're allowed to come here? And what will they do here? And will people really, want to be here? And it has been incredibly well received by all of Oakland. Lots of different kinds of people come here to do lots of different kinds of things, but we've been particularly pleased to see how it works as recreational space and recreational space for movement, which is something we thought about: bikes and roller skaters and skateboarders and others in the space. And there's a lot of love for it for sort of 3 generational groups. Last 3 slides, I think. So this is then the bike path, which will connect to future parks. We only have about 1/3 of a mile of the Bay Trail in this project, but in the end, there's, I think, almost 2 miles of Bay Trail in all 4 of the parks. And it comes along this side of this and connects to Jack London, as well as to parks to the south. And from inside the 9th Avenue terminal, when you look back out at the park, you can get a sense of how those 3 pieces of truss stack up, and how the sort of the quality of the space, which is a lot about holding empty space with very little, but enough that it feels defined and enough that you know where to go. And it's been really interesting to see how people have made this their own, how that large ramp, which was, obviously needed because we wanted to be, to do universal design, but has become one of the favorite places for kids age sort of like 2 to 5. And it's been very interesting to see how this topography evoked a lot of things and a lot of ways to use it. So right now, this is phase 1. There are 4 phases of parks. And so we'll be working on the second phase. Right now we're in construction documents, which is the piece that goes from 5th Avenue around one side of this Clinton Basin and connects back to Township Commons. And we're sort of working on that one. We have no idea if we'll work on more after that, but we're really excited to do that one also because it's on ground and we'll be able to really plant some big things, which is really exciting for us, and just to sort of see this vision come all the way together. My closing slide or comment, because I felt I needed to say something about urban design given the forum, is just that it's a really interesting time in Oakland because we have one of the last sort of functioning industrial waterfronts in the East Bay area. And that waterfront is super valuable for that reason. And we're always going to have a partially industrial waterfront, but we also have this emerging kind of reconnection to the waterfront and people more residential and people using it. And so I think we have a very interesting consideration of how to bring those two things together, how to separate them appropriately, and also how to connect our parks back into our neighborhoods and make sure that people have a way to get here. I don't think we'll get a simple diagram of just lining the water's edge with joyful recreational parks. I think it's going to be messier and maybe more interesting than that. And I'm excited to see where it's all going. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Very well done. Appreciate that. You covered a lot of stuff quickly.
Yes.
Impressive. I'm trying to start through the questions, and this is a great way to end because I think I was thinking that based on the questions, go globally and then go back into the projects. So I think you touched upon it right here at the end. There's a question from Louise Ingalls about, okay, so there's 30 acres of built out parkland along the shoreline. Is that right? Or
At Brooklyn
30
Basin, yes.
Okay. And so, and they're really asking about this idea of connecting back into the neighborhoods and how is that done? So when you're dealing with Brooklyn Basin, what was the conversation around that? And like, particularly they're talking about Fruitvale and how that works. So I know right now there's, you have the railroads there, you have BART going through underground, Highway 880, all that stuff. How does that
Yeah, and I'm just going to pull up a different plan and I can't do it while it's sharing. So give me a second. It's a great question and a really important one. There are so few places where you can cross the freeway. And so our emphasis was a lot about Fifth Street and how to make Fifth Street a place where you felt really good about crossing the street. Crossing the freeway, because you can cross under there. And so, this became incredibly important. And actually, the developer decided to pay for bicycle lane improvements all the way back to 8th, partly to make that happen. As well, thinking about how you arrive here, then as a bike and pedestrian, there's a bus stop here, there's a future parking garage. This new piece that's coming, I think, is going to be a really big deal. I also think the bridge that was added here is a really big deal in terms of access, maybe from Oak Street and from the BART station. And so there is a weird site because it's cut off. And I think partly why we're so encouraged by the people coming is that, and we may have gotten very lucky with COVID, people are desperate for spaces. People have made this a destination for biking, but we're finding that people are finding it. And that social media helps. If someone is on Instagram and saying, there's this great new park, people have a desire to go find it. And so there's kind of physical geographies, but there's this other geography, and they seem to be working on our behalf.
Mm-hmm. In a similar way, thinking about it more horizontally, the connection of the Bay Trail. And so you started off by thinking about the Gateway Park and how that started connecting to more of the region, right? And so does Brooklyn Basin, where do we stand with the Bay Trail and its connections through all these projects that you're talking about? And then in particular in Brooklyn Basin and I guess further south.
Yes. Well, so this map, if you look really close, has dashed lines for Bay Trail and solid lines for Bay Trail. And so we're in the process of building our part of it. There's some complexity in the ownership where there's a piece of land that is not owned by Brooklyn Basin. So right now the Bay Trail has to go back to Embarcadero. But in general, the vision really is that the Bay Trail makes our waterfront democratic and makes it accessible. And it's the thing in the continuity and the totality of it that makes it available for all of us. And so there's a commitment to having it be strong through all of Brooklyn Basin. And then I think it's going to be a big deal because our office is really close to Jack London, and just when we started, we walked from Union Point Park, which is, down over here, all the way up and looked at all of the waterfront to see what was working and what wasn't. And it's tough. I mean, it's not a very great walking experience, but the parts that are going in now are better, and extending it and making it better, I think ultimately it all gets improved. I really want to see Broadway improved, and the bike connections, you know, from downtown Oakland. And there's a bike bridge that's proposed to cross from the Lake Merritt trails over the freeway and over the railroad and under the freeway or something like that. But it wiggles over here and lands right at the park. And I think all that connectivity will eventually make it work better. The more is more, kind of, as you build more trail.
Yeah, exactly. So Nate had a question about the Howard terminal, which I think is actually probably good too, because there's not that many pieces of maybe developable land right now along the waterfront, and that is a big hunk that, you know, there might be a ballpark there at some point. The AR, I think, just got approved, so it's getting closer. Do you have thoughts? You guys gonna do that project too to fill
No,
up your,
no. I think there's a New York firm involved in that. No. I mean, I have thoughts about that as an Oaklander and as a sort of business owner in the neighborhood. I think it's really interesting. I think that project is right at this tension we were talking about industrial uses and recreational uses. And I'm interested to see how they take it on, and if that could be something really interesting. I think, you know, kids are interested in heavy equipment. Like, it could be great, but I think it has to be embraced.
yeah, that's true. I don't know. Is there any questions that people have that they want to speak verbally about? I have some other
Sure.
ones, but they're more microcosmic. So, Jay.
I did, yeah, sir. It's kind of, you threw this out there in the middle of your Jack London focus, but I just wondering if you elaborate on it. Is, you mentioned that you build a lot of your designs, which, you know, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, and I should be super clear. I don't mean I build or Liz builds, because there are people who do that, and that is really hard work. I mean that we don't just like draw a vision. We really do construction documents and go through field and see projects all the way to the end, and sometimes even into activation phases. And I think it changes how we think about planning. We've been talking about kind of the idea of full circle thinking. And my example that I like to use that's a little bit unfair is like, every urban design plan has like perfectly arranged alleys of trees on both sides. But if you've ever had to like lay out a sidewalk with vaults and, you know, utilities and all the things you really have to deal with, you know how hard that actually is. And so I think thinking about design from the perspective of a respect for what it takes to build things changes your respect for built things, which is maybe good. There's a great, actually, Jeannie Gang video recently about carbon and saving carbon by saving old buildings. And I think there's something to be said for respecting, you know, the work that has gone into things.
Well, thanks.
I really quite believe in that as well. In particular, like how material culture brings memory from hundreds of years ago, you know, back into a current dialogue. And like in particular, the Bollard move was a great one that looked like that to me, which felt like that was probably somewhat difficult to, well, just to get there, period, to actually move it there. But to get it to satisfy the Bollard need that potentially was required, was there any story behind that, or was that easy? Was that an easy one? Was there
that was an easy one, like, relatively speaking.
Drag that over here.
What?
Just like drag that over here, kind of.
Well, I mean, it was a map of the site with a bunch of photographs that were labeled like A, B, C, and please save these things. They all went into a container for 2 years or something. And then towards the end, we really hadn't decided for sure where they were going. And then it was like, oh, we have a problem. Where are we going to put them? And we were like, this will be a great answer. So, I mean, I think it was a little bit of luck, but I think it's also believing in your own gut. Like, we saved it for a reason. We couldn't save everything, and then you kind of have some resources to draw on. So
Mitchell Schwartzer had a comment. Do you want to unmute and ask your question? It might be a little unfair to Sarah, but she can probably
Uh-oh.
probably put some opinions to it.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm just curious. I mean, there is a history in Oakland of building very promising parks along the waterfront and then letting them go to rot.
Oh, I have a good
And,
answer.
you know Channel Park, right?
I do.
Yeah, and then Estuary Park, right, which is above it, which was once a sculpture garden that was established by the Oakland Museum. It has sculptures by Mark DeSuvero, Michael Heitzer. They're all just falling to pieces. And that's been going on for like 20 years, that kind of deterioration. And then, more sadly, Union Point Park, which was open with great fanfare, like
Not long
15 years?
ago. Yeah.
10 to 15 years ago, and now is a complete wreck and scary to go to. I tried to walk there not long ago, and there were just hyperthermic syringes all over the place, and just so it does seem that the Ninth Avenue site is pretty pristine so far, and maybe that is going to remain the case in the future because of the Brooklyn Basin developers, but it is a problem in Oakland, right? That, even the MLK shoreline, right, has kind of, it was really nice when it opened, and now it's, also falling apart in a lot of places. So I wonder.
It's a great question. And so there's a secret thing, but I try to say it as often as I can, which is the cost of most landscape maintenance outstrips the capital cost of a project in 1 year. So it doesn't matter what it costs. And some of the landscape projects that are being held up as glorious, like the High Line or some of these others, have extraordinary price tags for maintenance. I'm kind of a believer in maintenance and think it's a good thing, and it's valuable and should be invested in. And I'm happy to tell you that there is a central mechanism at Brooklyn Basin. So all of the HOAs are contributing to a fund for the maintenance of all of the parks. So the funding to pay for the care of the parks and to maintain them has a dedicated source that can only be spent there, which actually factored into our thinking about the design. The other thing that I think is a really big deal that I would like to see more of is the 9th Avenue Terminal has a grocery store and a restaurant, some retail, and a kayak store. So there's people there, and there's a public bathroom inside the building. So just having an activated use at a park, so it feels like someone's there, can utterly transform what happens in that park. Parks that have no sense of like ground floor relationship and no sense of like somebody paying attention are where really tough things start to happen. And I think Union Point Park is a great example of that. Like, it's not close enough to anything. It's cut off by the road and it's not anybody's. So, it's sort of, things happen there differently versus in places where you have buildings. You can even see that at Lake Merritt, like next to Lake Chalet versus other areas. It makes a big difference. And so the mixed up city fabric of, restaurants in the middle of parks and pavilions, like those make a big, big difference. So I'm optimistic actually about Brooklyn Basin.
Right.
A couple of questions about sea level rise, which at Brooklyn Basin, maybe any of these projects.
Yeah. So what's really interesting about the project is when it was finished in 2006, it was the poster child for sea level rise, and it was the first project to achieve a state standard. And so there's a 36 inches above base flood elevation was set for the whole project. And the height of the lowest surface at Township Commons is about 9 feet above current high tide. So it's pretty high in some ways. I would say from what we now know today, we are also planning for adaptation and trying to figure out, what we would do. And that was part of our approvals to do that. But we are pleased that our starting point, partly because we also have a historic building that's at that elevation, is 9 feet above today's high water.
So going deeper on the historic building, so you have this vision of you going out there and looking at the trusses and the beautiful light coming through it, and then finding pieces to preserve. And so your role, or EK's role overall, on designing it, sounds like Michael Willis is involved in some historic aspects. Were you like the architect of the structure, or it also sounds like there's maybe more that's coming, right, with the kayak shop and other
Kayak
things?
shop is there.
Okay.
So this is a great question, and actually, I will tell you, somebody pointed out to me that people might think we didn't do the architecting, but we did. So the building was cut into 3 pieces. The 2 trusses, the one with the hill in it and the middle one, were 100% Einwheeler keel with the support of SGH as a structural engineer. The 9th Avenue terminal piece that was sort of kept more intact and has condition space. Michael Willis's office did the interior shell and the facades of that, and worked on the retrofit. We also, had conversations with, so this piece is less ours. And then other architects have been involved. I think Flynn Architecture and others have been involved in the interiors and tenant improvements on the inside of the building. So there's a couple of hands in it, but in fact, even though it's odd for a landscape architect, we did do the design and structural coordination and all the drawings for the 2 of the 3 trusses.
What was that like? I mean, that had to be a pretty good learning curve, right?
Yes, sort of. I mean, I think the bad good thing maybe about my personality and Liz's personality is we like to do things we've never done before, probably more than we like other things. And we also we're generalists, but we kind of believe in solving problems. We know about structures and we know about working on structures. So I think it I don't know, it was fun in one way and hard in one way. If anything, our big sort of bird over our shoulder was we wanted our architect friends to think we did a good job. So we had some like street credibility. So we're motivated.
I think I've made it through the ones that are in the chat. If anyone has a question that they want to unmute and ask, Sarah, please do. Otherwise, I'll jump in and fill the void. Maybe I'll jump in and let people think about it a little bit more. So I'm super, the Jack London thing is just, it just seems like you made so much out of something that could have been horrible or is really kind of a nothing project potentially, depending on whose hands it was in. So what's the process for doing that? I love it. It's this big urban thing, even though it's just these little pieces of really bright, beautiful furniture. I just think it's really compelling and pretty amazing intervention into that neighborhood or non-neighborhood, depending on how you think about it.
Wants to be a neighborhood, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of what so we go to lunch there from the office, like go to the taco truck and go to the water. And I think when you work in this field, you're visual and you think about, well, why don't I like that? Or what's weird about that? What's ugly about that? What's whatever? And so I think we had a certain number of hours of being there thinking, I don't like that. I don't like, why did they plant that? Why this, why that? And so given the opportunity to do it, I think there was a little bit of back thinking. I think the other thing was there was a very clear idea from the beginning that it was visually cluttered. And so it became a very simple directive of just like, how do you simplify? How do you make things disappear that are taking your attention away from what you might want to look at or what might be beautiful? And so that process of editing was a big part of it, of like just figuring out how to control what you would want to look at there. And there's there's a lot going on. There's some crazy paving patterns. There's a lot of other things that are kind of, it's still pretty chaotic, but it's a lot better.
Yeah, what's great about Jack London is it's so well programmed, unlike a lot of parks. Talking about this idea of maintenance and everything, but they just constantly have events and things going on that activate it, even though it has this horrible connection to the city and all these other things kind of going against it.
Yep.
Which is really amazing. It really helps it.
Yeah, that is an envious programming schedule there.
Are there any sites on your walks through, through the Oakland waterfront that seem like ripe for intervention that are potential out there that you
That's
identify?
interesting. I don't know if I think about it as much in terms of waterfront, but I certainly have some, favorite empty lots in downtown Oakland or other spaces that I would like to see transformed. I feel like Oakland's really so fantastic in so many ways. I'm really excited about the project we're working on with you guys, Brian. I think the question of like, how do you do a project that really contributes to your city and to the public realm, and that that you feel like is transformative, not just kind of coloring in the lines. I think it's just something that we think about a lot. I think we've been lucky to work. We worked on the Uptown Station building and did a series of 3 roof gardens that we're really proud of. I mean,
That's the Sears building.
old Capwell's Sears buildings that I'm really excited about. But I don't know. I think honestly, like, we're as excited about like something very small as very large. We're a little nerdy is what the truth of the matter is.
Just good thinkers. You can create
Maybe,
out of,
yeah.
of adverse
Maybe.
situations.
Yeah, maybe. But yeah, I mean, we're excited about a lot of things. We're grateful to get to work locally. Liz is going to give a talk at the ASLA about, we hope, about what we've learned from working locally and how it changes how you work. And I think for us, working locally has meant like really getting to know your plant palette really, really well, not just sort of in a zone, but like, how do you really know where you are? It's meant relationships with fabricators and relationships with contractors and relationships with architects and regulators, and all of that layering of relationships has been what I think helps make things better. That you work in community and you work with others and you collaborate, and then as those relationships get really trusted, I feel like you can do better work. So I think for us, working locally has been a real gift in some ways.
Is some of your work non-local then, or is it all pretty much local? Or
so we have our farthest south project is in Big Sur. We have some high-end residential work in Big Sur, and then we have a few projects for a very special client in Portland, and then but they're all for one client, and then we have one in Calistoga, but that's kind of it. The majority is kind of Bay Area plus Big Sur and Napa Valley kind of thing.
Frank, I see your hand up virtually. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the great presentation. It was really fun to see it. I haven't been down there in a while, and I really look forward to going down there.
Oh, great.
As you were talking, I was looking around on Google Maps, cruising around Street View, and I noticed that they have a water view also on Google Maps. You can cruise by, but it's very old.
Huh.
I wondered if you had actually done a water view since you've been there, since you very nicely have tested all your designs by being there and looking and carefully observing and asking all those why questions to help you get there.
Yes. So we have a woman in the office who is an expert kayaker, and so she facilitated an all-office kayaking trip, which we went and explored the site from the water's edge because it's quite different. And she has been back, I think, since the park has opened. I have not kayaked since it's been open, but the dock just went in at CCYK, so you can paddleboard or kayak now from here by Broadside. And we would like to. I think sea level rise is fascinating, not just from the threat perspective of sea level rise, but from the opportunity of reconnecting with our waterfront, maybe forced to be reconnect. But I think it's really interesting to imagine the Bay Area with a lot of boats and ferries and water transportation, and what would that look like? And there is going to be a water taxi that lands at this site that will go to Alameda and Jack London. It's just like 4 stops up and down the estuary. But I think that's going to be really a great thing to have here. And that the water, you go to other cities and sometimes, the water is wonderful. I like to take the ferry to San Francisco instead of BART when I used to do that. And it would be great if these projects could help build the water trail and could help build our connection back to the water.
Yeah, I agree, because I always took the ferry when I was going back and forth, and there's so much overlap of the different kind of water traffic between the Coast Guard, the sailboats, the
Yep.
Cal crew, and everybody who's using it, but they don't get down this far much, or the public doesn't from the water side. It'd be really nice.
Yeah.
And
Well,
there's
and
taxis.
it's, yeah. Well, and there are like the Oakland Strokes and all the high school crew teams. If you go out here at the right time of day, it's quite busy, but it still feels a little bit rarefied, I would say, like it's for some and not all. And it would be nice if there were more ways for the average bear to get out there.
The average
Thank
Cal Bear.
you.
Maybe not Cal Bear. Yeah.
So that water
Interesting.
taxi, is that a done deal? That's
Yes.
definitely happening? Wow.
Yes.
Didn't hear that.
Yeah.
Nice.
Do you want to ask your question? Unmute and ask.
Sure.
I'll just put in a plug if I could.
Yeah.
I'm a part of the AIA California Urban Design Committee, and each year we put on a award program in combination with ASLA.
Oh,
So I'd love for you to submit this project for
Thank
that if
you.
you would like to.
I would love to. Thank you. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
learning about those sorts of things right now. It's a
The
lot of work, those
advertisement will come
awards.
out in about a month.
Okay, super. Thank you so much.
So I had a couple questions. It's interesting hearing about the water taxi. I was asking, what are your thoughts about connections between Oakland and Alameda across the estuary? And then secondly, when you were talking about your non-local projects, how do those influence your work, or how does your work in Oakland influence your work elsewhere?
Very different questions. I'm a big believer that if we could have more connection to Alameda, it would sure be good for Alameda for one thing. They have real traffic issues, but also I think using your water makes you value it. And so there's a lot of talk in landscape architecture, but in general about ecology and sustainability. And I think it needs to be rooted in human experience, and just being on the water where you might see a bird or you might see, I think is a huge part of that. And I would like there to be more ways to connect here. So, I mean, there's some stuff that's planned. There's an idea about a bridge. There's a bunch of other things. But I think in general, low tech and things that can really happen are great. So I would say, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of how I think about it. And then in terms of our work elsewhere, I mean, we're definitely like true believers in site-specific design. Like there's things about every place that are super particular and the designs have to relate to them. I think we're equally true believers in things like proportion and things that are beautiful. And so it's kind of a mashup of both those things. When we work outside of the Bay Area, the hardest part is establishing the relationships with contractors or having enough time to make the connections that make something really good. And so we spend a lot of time investing in that kind of thing and making sure that making sure that we can really get things done, not just have ideas, I guess.
Thanks, Winston.
Maybe a follow-up question. You earlier in the presentation, you talked a little bit about how there was a concern with Brooklyn Basin reflecting Oakland in how the design came together. What are your thoughts, if any, from kind of having gone through it, about what makes Oakland Oakland, or how this project is particular to Oakland?
Sure. That's a great question and a complicated one. So when it was described as not being Oakland, it had bull-nose granite seats, and it had axial sort of fleur-de-lis things, that were really funny here in some ways. It just didn't, it felt like it came from another place. And so I think the desire was to do something that talked to the industrial history of the site. And so it's very specific and talking to the 9th Avenue terminal. And so in this location, there was work that was done, a master plan for the waterfront by Walter Hood and somebody else. And, it really talked about the industrial history. And so it was kind of defined for us what Oakland meant in this location. I think what I like about it is it's a lot of different things, and it means different things to different people. But I think there are some shared values around kind of populist values, a sort of for everyone rather than what's the most elite fancy thing we can do. And I think there are shared values around equity by a lot of people in Oakland. And so part of our thinking when we do public space is probably to think a lot about those things, and it might be a different character in different places, but our goal to make it Oakland is really to make it accessible and desirable for everyone in Oakland to want to come use it, because then they'll make it Oakland. It's not really ours. So I think some tension in what I'm saying, because I'm kind of saying it will happen, but I'm a big believer if you make settings that are really compelling or spaces that are really compelling, then people use them, and they use them in ways you couldn't imagine, and that's great. So I think that's why Township Commons feels successful. People are using it in all kinds of ways, and it feels authentic. It feels like it's of our time. It feels like there's a lot of people from all over the city, and they don't all want to do the same thing there. So for me, that's the tell that we succeeded, but I don't know that it's like this. And I will say I've gone to a lot of, for a while, I think we got known as like an Oakland landscape architect, and we would meet with architects who would be like, I'm going to do a building in Oakland, and it's going to have core 10. Because that's Oakland, because you're industrial. And it was kind of a shorthand, like that's who you are. And it used to make me really mad. And we put together a collection of architectural detail photos, like showing old tile, showing the I Magnum building, showing things that we like about Oakland. And there's a huge range, right? And so I think that would be all I would say is I know what it's not, but then I think there's a broad range, or I know what would be too limiting. I think there's a really broad range of what it is, and it's a very long and awesome history.
I like that as an ending. That was beautiful.
Thanks, Brian.
Make Oakland great, whatever Oakland is. Well, thanks for joining us, Sarah. I really appreciate you showing your work and actually finally making this happen. And maybe once we get out of COVID, we can do the tour that we had talked about a while ago of Brooklyn Basin. That'd be a lot of fun.
We'd be happy to do it. We'd do a bike tour probably if you guys want to do it.
That'd be great. All right. Well, I'll see hopefully a lot of you next month, first Thursday, for the Regional Urban Design Forum. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Tyler, for helping put this together and future programs.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you guys so much for inviting me.
It's great.